In November 1972, Queen signed a contract that gave away almost everything they had. They were 25 years old, they had no money, no recording deal, and no leverage, and a pair of brothers from Sheffield named Jack and Barry Sheffield sat them down in an office in Soho and put 31 pages in front of them. 1% royalty rate, £60 a week each as a living allowance, every expense recoupable against future earnings. The standard rate in the industry was 3%. Nobody told them that. They signed. Of course they signed. They had been living in a flat with a broken boiler and selling their clothes to buy guitar strings. The contract gave them access to a recording studio. It gave them the possibility of a future. What it did not give them, and what they would not understand for 3 more years, was any realistic path to being paid for the music they were about to make. By October 1975, Bohemian Rhapsody was climbing toward #1. It would stay there for 9 weeks. It remains one of the best-selling singles in British chart history. And Freddie Mercury, the man who had written it, who had conceived every note of its impossible 6-minute architecture, who had spent 3 days recording vocal harmonies in a studio in Rockfield, Wales Freddie Mercury was overdrawn. He was borrowing money to pay his rent. The royalties from one of the most famous recordings ever made had not yet reached him, because under the terms of the contract he had signed in 1972, there was no mechanism by which they could. This is the story of how that happened, who fixed it, and what it cost. Before we go any further, if you want the stories behind the music, the contracts they hid, the negotiations that nearly ended careers before they started to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. These are the stories they hoped you would never find. Jack Sheffield and his brother Barry had founded Trident Audio Productions in 1968. By 1972, they were operating out of St. Anne's Court in Soho, and Trident Studios on the same street had developed a reputation as one of the better mid-size recording facilities in London. The Beatles had used it. David Bowie had used it. The Sheffield brothers were not dishonest men in the way that requires a deliberate scheme. They were businessmen of a particular era who wrote contracts that maximized their own position and assumed the other party would either understand what they were signing or hire someone who did. Queen did neither. The 31-page document had 3 principal mechanisms that together created an unescapable trap. The first was the royalty rate, 1% of retail on recorded product. This was, in 1972, approximately 1/3 of what a recording artist could reasonably expect from a fair negotiation. It was not illegal. It was simply the lowest end of a range that most experienced managers would have refused without a counteroffer. Queen had no experienced manager. They had each other. The second mechanism was the weekly allowance. £60 per week per band member was structured not as a salary, but as an advance against future royalties. This meant that every week they lived on £60, they fell £60 deeper into recoupment debt. The allowance covered basic subsistence. It covered nothing else. Studio costs, equipment rental, travel, accommodation on the road, all of it was added to a running total that Queen owed Trident before a single penny of royalties could be released to them. The total climbed steadily from the first day of the contract. It never stopped climbing. The third mechanism was the expenses clause, and this was the most quietly devastating of the 3. Trident, as the contracting party responsible for production and management, was permitted to charge administrative and overhead costs to Queen's account at their own discretion. The clause used the word reasonable once, in parentheses, with no definition attached. What was reasonable was, in practice, whatever Trident chose to enter in the ledger. The years between 1972 and 1975 were not years of stagnation. Queen had recorded 2 albums. They had toured extensively. Killer Queen had reached #2 in the UK charts in 1974 and broken them into the mainstream with a force that few debut acts achieve. By any external measure, they were a success. The music press had noticed. Radio had noticed. The audiences had noticed. But the financial reality inside the Trident structure was something entirely different from what the outside world could see. Roger Taylor kept a notebook. This is documented by the people who knew him during that period. He tracked every expense, every advance, every tour cost that appeared on the Trident ledger. He was the member of the band who most clearly understood, even in the early period, that the numbers were not adding up in any direction that would eventually result in them being paid. He brought his notebook to meetings. He asked questions that the Sheffield brothers preferred not to answer with specificity. He was told that the accounting was complex and would be settled in due course. The notebook got thicker. Freddie, by contrast, was not a man who organized his anxieties into columns and rows. His response to financial pressure was not documentation, but a kind of furious productivity, more work, more ideas, more recordings, as though the answer to the problem was simply to make the catalog too valuable to suppress. In 1975, as Queen were recording what would become A Night at the Opera, Freddie was living in a rented flat in Kensington that he could not fully afford. He had borrowed from friends. He had borrowed from his parents. The weekly £60 came in, and it covered almost nothing. He did not speak about it publicly, and he would not speak about it publicly for the rest of his life. But the people who knew him in those years have described a specific kind of tension in him that they had not seen before, and would not see again, the tension of a man who understands that the thing being taken from him is time, and that time cannot be recovered. Jim Beach was a solicitor. He was 31 years old in 1975, working in entertainment law in London, and he had not yet met any member of Queen when a mutual contact suggested he might want to look at a contract that was causing his clients some difficulty. Jim Beach read the contract on a Friday night. The following Monday morning, he called the band. What Jim Beach found in those 31 pages was not a single dramatic wrongdoing, but something more troubling. A structure that had been designed to function exactly as it was functioning. There was no clause that had been secretly inserted, no forged signature, no fraud that could be pointed to in a courtroom. There was only a contract that both parties had signed, and that was now producing, with perfect mechanical regularity, an outcome in which one of the most commercially successful bands in Britain was unable to pay their rent. The question was not whether it was legal, the question was how to get them out of it. The negotiations took 7 weeks. They took place in offices across Soho, a different location each time, deliberately, because Jim Beach understood that the geography of negotiation carries its own kind of pressure, and he wanted Trident off their home terrain, at least occasionally. He brought a junior colleague. Queen attended selectively Brian May, and Roger Taylor came to most sessions. Freddie and John Deacon to fewer. This was tactical. Jim Beach had assessed within the first meeting that the Sheffield brothers responded differently to different members of the band, and he arranged the presence in each room accordingly. The central problem was the recoupment balance. By late 1975, the total amount Queen theoretically owed Trident under the expenses and advance structure had reached a figure that would have required years of back catalog exploitation at the contracted royalty rate to clear. Trident's position, stated plainly, was that Queen could not leave the contract without settling this balance in cash. Trident's calculation was that Queen did not have the cash, had no realistic prospect of raising it, and would therefore remain bound by the contract indefinitely. Jim Beach's counterposition rested on 2 arguments. The first was a detailed analysis of the expenses charged to the Queen account under the discretionary clause, a number of which, examined carefully against the definition of reasonable that any court would apply, were difficult to defend. He did not threaten litigation directly. He placed the analysis on the table and let the Sheffield brothers read it. The second argument was simpler. Bohemian Rhapsody was now at number 1. It would generate licensing, sync, international broadcast, and foreign royalty income for decades. The asset that Trident held was not a struggling band's back catalog. It was the master recording of one of the most significant commercial properties in contemporary music. The value of that asset was conditional on the continued goodwill and public profile of the 4 men who had created it. Jim Beach did not say what would happen to that goodwill if the negotiations failed. He did not need to. The settlement figure agreed after 7 weeks was £100,000. Queen did not have £100,000. The identity of the lender who provided it has never been made public. The money was transferred on a Thursday. The contract was dissolved. Jim Beach made the call from a telephone box on Dean Street, around the corner from the offices where the final document had just been signed. He told Freddie, "It's done." Freddie said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Right, good." That was all. The first royalty payment Queen received under their new arrangement, a direct deal with EMI, negotiated by Jim Beach in the weeks immediately following the Trident settlement, arrived in early 1976. The amount exceeded 3 years of Trident earnings combined. This is not an estimate or a journalistic approximation. It is the figure that the people directly involved have consistently confirmed when asked. 3 years of the Trident structure, in total, produced less than what Queen were owed in the first royalty cycle under a properly structured deal. Roger Taylor kept the notebook. He did not destroy it when the settlement was reached. He kept it for years. He has referred to it obliquely in interviews without specifying what it contained or where it is now. It is, in the vocabulary of that period, the material record of an injustice that was experienced in real time and documented with the care of someone who understood that proof matters. It matters when you are 25 and the people across the table are telling you that everything is fine and the numbers will be settled in due course. It matters when they are wrong. Jim Beach became Queen's full-time manager shortly afterward. He is known within the Queen orbit by the nickname Miami, a name whose origin is affectionately disputed among the people who used it. He managed the band for the remainder of Freddie Mercury's life and continues to manage the Queen estate today. The Trident contract is not discussed in the authorized accounts of Queen's history in any detail. It appears in footnotes. It is summarized in a sentence or two as an early difficulty that was resolved. The 31 pages have never been published. The notebook has never been published. What is known and what the numbers confirm is this. Between November 1972 and late 1975, Queen produced music that would generate income for the next 50 years and received from that music £60 a week each plus a recoupment balance that was designed to grow faster than they could ever clear it. The money that should have reached them did not reach them. The mechanism that prevented it from reaching them was not a secret, and it was not illegal. It was a contract. It was 31 pages. It was signed by 4 young men who had no reason to understand what they were reading and no one to tell them. There is a particular quality to the injustice of the Trident contract that separates it from the ordinary financial exploitation of young musicians, which is common enough to require no special attention from history. What separates it is the simultaneity. In October and November 1975, 2 realities existed in parallel. In one reality, Bohemian Rhapsody was playing on every radio in Britain, climbing a chart, entering a culture, becoming the kind of thing that people would still be listening to 50 years later. In the other reality, the man who had written it was overdrawn. These 2 realities occupied the same calendar, the same weeks, the same exact moment in time. The song was everywhere. The man who wrote it was borrowing money to pay his rent. That simultaneity is not a footnote. It is the whole point. Jim Beach restructured everything. The EMI deal, the publishing, the international licensing, the management structure that would take Queen from Bohemian Rhapsody to We Are the Champions to Live Aid to the largest stadium shows in the world. He built, over the following 15 years, the financial architecture that made the scale of Queen's later career possible, the architecture that Trident had specifically prevented from existing. Freddie Mercury never spoke publicly about the Trident period in terms of what it had cost him personally. In interviews when the subject arose, he was brisk and dismissive, as though it had been a minor inconvenience rather than 3 years of deliberate structural deprivation. This was entirely characteristic of the man. He did not revisit injuries he had already closed. He moved forward with an energy that sometimes looked like indifference to the past, but was in fact something more considered a refusal to allow what had already been taken from him to take anything further. The £100,000 that was borrowed to settle the contract was repaid. The lender has never come forward. Jim Beach has never disclosed the name. The money moved through a private arrangement that left no public trace, and the people who know the full story have apparently decided, collectively, that it belongs in the category of things Freddie Mercury was allowed to keep private. That category was larger than most people understood. The £60 a week is gone. The notebook is somewhere. The 31 pages are somewhere. The song is still everywhere. If this story changed how you hear Bohemian Rhapsody, If you believe the full story behind the music deserves to be told, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We are not finished.